When you hit the confusing and vulnerable teenage years, a lot is happening. You're growing out of childhood into something else. Hormones are raging and your body, voice and mental abilities are all evolving in what will be a giant leap forward for you. Something you haven't experienced since those intense first months after you enter the world and you adjust to life on the outside. While you're going through this epic change, so are your peers, and sometimes that can lead to conflict. This is the age where bullying can ramp up, social interactions can become more awkward, feelings can intensify. Sometimes it's hard to understand teenage behaviour. The arguments, the defiance, the disdain towards parents as they challenge authority. But what if that behaviour becomes more than typical teen evolution? What if that behaviour becomes murderous? In 2001, 3-year-old Courtney Morley-Clarke was growing up on the New South Wales Central Coast. It's January 28, and Courtney, a tiny blonde-haired little girl who lived with her older brother and her parents, was put to bed around 8:30 p.m. As is typical in Australia in January, it was hot. Her parents had left the main doors open, but had shut and locked the screen doors to allow the cooler night air to circulate through the house as they slept. Her mum checked in on her two children around 1 a.m. to find her little daughter sleeping soundly in the bunk she shared with her brother. But when her dad got up around 7 that morning, he quickly noticed that the screen door and the side gate were both wide open. He raced into his children's room and found Courtney's bed empty. The rail of the bed was down. Could Courtney have done that herself? She's so little. He raced outside thinking maybe she'd somehow gotten herself up, let herself outside, and was now wandering out there alone. He found her nightie lying on the ground near the gate. He checked the road, the bushes nearby. Courtney was nowhere to be seen. He would very soon have his heart broken, not only finding out that his dear little Courtney was dead, but that her killer was a child too. I'm Claire Murphy, and this is True Crime Conversations, a podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. On the morning that Courtney was discovered missing, their neighbours, the parents of an adoptive son who we cannot identify, told police that the boy had been absent from their home in the early hours. His mum had realised it when she'd gotten up and found the back door of their house wide open and the 13-year-old not in his bed. The father drove around looking for his son, but he couldn't find him, relieved when he finally returned just before 3 a.m. through his sister's bedroom window. Wearing only a pair of shorts, he told his father that he'd been out walking and playing with his pet duck. On searching their backyard though, they found his clothes hidden in an alcove under their swimming pool. His father and the police confronted him about the whereabouts of little Courtney, to which he denied having any knowledge. But eventually, he admits he'd seen her while she was out walking, offering to lead police to a cave where he'd left her sleeping. A search of the area failed to locate her, as the boy continued to give contradictory accounts of what had happened that night. Only after police, who'd been desperately searching the areas pointed out by the boy, pleaded with him to tell them where she really was, did he finally reveal what he'd done. The boy, known in the courts only as SLD, had gone to the neighbour's house, slashed open the screen door and gone into the children's room. He told police initially he'd done so to steal computer games after the boy who lived there had bragged about having them. But when he saw the little sister, he chose to take her for ransom instead. He later admitted that he'd actually intended to kill the older brother, who he claimed had bullied him at Scouts Group, along with 2 others who he also planned to murder in time. He told detectives that he removed the little girl's nappy while she was still sleeping in her bed, and then removed the rest of her clothes later, in order to find a good place to stab her. He carried her towards his home, laying her down on a concrete driveway, where he stabbed her once in the chest, covering her mouth and nose with his hand when she cried out in pain. After she stopped struggling, he took her body and threw her up an embankment, covering her with the long grass before returning to his home, washing up and changing his clothes before heading back inside. He commented during his interview that once he'd killed one person, he expected it would make it easier to kill the next one, and the one after that. SLD would become Australia's youngest ever convicted murderer, and had he been an adult at the time of his crime, he would have probably been sentenced to the maximum term available, facing life behind bars. But he wasn't. He was 13 years and 10 months old. After spending 22 years behind bars, SLD was released into the community in 2023 under line of sight supervision. An NDIS worker was supposed to watch his every move, although a witness claimed during one incident the worker was seen watching his phone rather than his charge. Over 95 days of his release, the now 38-year-old SLD approached nearly 200 women. The court told he was desperate to lose his virginity, sometimes even approaching women with their young children. One instance saw him approach a woman who was getting her young son changed at an outdoor shower. This was witnessed by an undercover police officer who advised of the breach. SLD was placed back behind bars. Psychiatric reports showed he was suffering from mental health issues, including delayed maturation and institutionalisation. They diagnosed him with a severe personality disorder that led to him being completely self-centred and without the ability to show empathy. He served another 13 months, but earlier this year, despite an application to detain him further, the New South Wales State Government, citing that SLD continues to show violent tendencies, has shared plans to remove his electronic monitoring device and had attacked prison staff while incarcerated. The Supreme Court refused. The court justice noted the risk for sexual offence and obsessive fixation on those he believed had wronged him, including towards the off-duty officer who reported his breaches, were concerning, but that he was not satisfied to a high degree of probability that the threshold required under legislation to impose a continuing detention order had been met. So he will be allowed back out into the community. Monitored, we can never know his true identity. The suppression order remaining in place due to his offence occurring when he was a minor. Criminal psychologist Tim Watson-Munro, the co-host of the Motive and Method podcast, has spent 40 years analysing the minds of some of the country's worst criminals, from murderers to sex offenders, terrorists, and those who have abducted and tortured children. He's peeked into the thoughts of evil. He joins us now to try and unpack the thinking of SLD and whether he can ever truly adjust back into the real world. Tim, thank you so much for joining us on True Crime Conversations today. We are speaking about the case of SLD, who we cannot identify due to the fact that he was a minor at the time of his offending. But I wanted to get some idea from you first in your career. Like, do you remember the first time you sat down with a murderer to try and figure out like who they are and why they had done what they had done? Like, do you remember those first moments that you spent trying to understand people who do evil?
I do. I'm blessed or cursed with an extraordinary memory. So I can recall my first day at work as the resident psychologist at Parramatta Jail. It was the 14th of August 1978, so we're getting pretty close to the 48 year anniversary. I can remember the Lysol, the smells, the wolf whistles. And Parramatta Jail in those days, it's been decommissioned now, was a multi-recidivist maximum security prison, which in essence meant it was an end-of-the-line prison for intractable prisoners, people that had nowhere else to go. When they closed down Katingal, which was the maximum security supermax jail really in Sydney, all of those people went to Parramatta Jail. I was 25, so I was pretty green. And day one, I was introduced to a guy who'd been convicted of murder. And I can remember how it affected me because I'd come from a fairly gentrified background. You know, my father was an academic. I studied classical music, and here I am in the worst jail in Australia at the age of 25. I'd never met a murderer before. And here we go, we've got a guy across the other side of my desk. I didn't know what to expect, but what I found was he was just like most people. He was an ordinary guy. He'd committed other crimes, but nothing as serious as that. Under the influence of drugs, he'd killed somebody. And there he was looking at a life sentence. And back in those days, they didn't have minimum terms. I mean, on average, people did about 14 years, but it was not guaranteed. It was subject to good behaviour and all the rest of it. So he was in the beginning of his sentence. He'd been there for about 3 years. He couldn't go anywhere else because of the magnitude of the conviction. He had to stay in maximum security. But he was ordinary, you know. He didn't have horns. He was polite, respectful. I didn't feel that I was in any sense of danger.
Did you ever have to treat anyone who was very young? Like, who do you think the youngest person was you've spoken to across your career? I mean, maybe not as young as SLD, who was 13 at the time, but how young have you been treating people who've committed some pretty heinous crimes?
Well, Parramatta Jail, of course, was an adult prison. But after I left there, I moved to Melbourne and I started doing assessments for courts. And the youngest person I've assessed was actually charged with murder. I can't recall his name. It was a bit of a thrill kill where a taxi driver was murdered in the 90s. And I went out to see him at what was known then as the Tirana Youth Training Centre. I think he was about 13 or 14 years of age.
Mm.
And I was staggered by the magnitude of the crime. And I still remember that interaction. I was staggered by the lack of empathy and remorse, which I put down to being just young and silly without trivialising what he'd done. But he clearly didn't have a conceptual grasp of the magnitude of what he had done and the consequences arising from that.
Well, with what you know of the case of SLD and the murder of Courtney Morley-Clarke, how could you help us understand what might push a 13-year-old boy to commit murder? And in this case, this was not a thrill kill. This was seemingly in cold blood.
Well, I didn't examine this person, but clearly, as the punishment reflected, there wasn't a mental health defence to it. In other words, he was in touch with reality. Notwithstanding his age, he clearly knew what he was doing, and he suffered the consequences of that. Rage, anger, opportunity. Speaking in more general terms, with these sorts of crimes, they're often preceded by fantasies of killing.
Well, can we talk about how to identify this? Because reading through the court documents on this, his family doesn't really say whether they'd seen any signs of behaviours that were concerning before Courtney's murder. But there is a documented instance where he'd taken another young girl, and this was just a week before Courtney was murdered, at a unit at a holiday resort where he'd been staying with his family, and he threatened to kill her unless she showed him her private parts, which she did, and then he took her back to her family. Like, how do you assess if that has happened a week before? That's a major escalation in just 7 days' time. Like, if you as a parent were told that your child had done that, like, just how much intervention should you have brought in at that time? And can that be a sign of something to escalate down the track?
Well, the first point I'd make is there's clearly a sexual component. That's a huge red flag. You've got show us your private parts, an abduction, highly dangerous situation, and a week later, this enormous tragedy occurs. I'm not critical of the parents who would expect that to occur, but at the very least, I think you'd want to have the child assessed, see a doctor, see what's going on, because there's some underlying drivers that have led to that episode, and in the absence of intervention, it escalated into a murder.
I guess we have to take into account too that this was happening sort of late January. It's still essentially the school holiday period. There is, access to mental health services are not always easy in the Australian health system. And, the fact that this escalated over just a week, that would have been very difficult for his family to get the help that he needed in that time, right?
I agree. I'm not critical of the family at all, but I guess as a more general proposition, if a child does that, you would want to get them in to see somebody expeditiously.
Assessment and treatment of juvenile offenders. Now, this often poses some pretty unique challenges when you compare it to adults entering the system, especially when the crime is something as serious as murder. Could you explain how mental health evaluations and approaches do differ between child offenders and what professionals must consider? In cases like SLDs, especially as you mentioned, sometimes these crimes are done because children are children and don't quite understand the consequences of what they've done. Like, how do you approach a child offender as opposed to an adult offender?
Well, it has to be with informed consent through the family, the parents. If they don't have a protective person there, there should be someone there. This is in terms of being questioned by the police. There has to be a spirit of cooperation. I worked for a time at the Melbourne Children's Court Clinic a long time ago. Highly professional organisation, very skilled practitioners there. The process itself is not that different. It's just how you handle it. You get a history where there's a child involved, where they may be unable to articulate that history in a comprehensive way. You speak to significant others in the person's life. Now, that may be parents, it may be foster carers, depending on who those people may be. You would request a lot of documentation surrounding the individual. Have they been in trouble before in terms of juvenile offending? Do they have any history of psychological disturbance? Do they have an intellectual disability? Is that documented? Or if it's red flag to you as the practitioner, you would obviously test to see whether they have a low IQ, because that's relevant to the issue of intent. If somebody doesn't understand the nature of what they're doing and the consequences beyond their age, just because they'll never get it, that needs to be looked at as well. So I guess what you're looking at is as much collateral informative data as you can obtain, medical reports, school reports, discussions with parents, discussions with school teachers or school counsellors if they saw those individuals, so that you get a pretty broad spectrum of information to enable you to formulate an opinion about the individual.
Can you explain to us what delayed maturation is in someone who's been incarcerated since they were very, very young? And this has been brought up in other cases where, say, like John Venables, for example, in the UK, who was only 10 years old when he and his friend murdered James Bulger, who was just 2. And he was in prison for a very long time and then was released and has ended up back in jail for child sex material exploitation offences. And a lot of the discussion is around him experiencing delayed maturation, and this has been brought up in SLD's case as well. Can you just explain to us what that means if someone is experiencing that from having been incarcerated from such a young age?
Well, their world is very confined. I mean, normally in the progression of life, you go to school, you acquire social skills, you bend and shape your behaviours accordingly, you have an education, you have a life that's, full of reward and sometimes failure. But in an institution, really what we're talking about is institutionalisation at a young age, where those opportunities, because you're incarcerated, are not available to you. You're interacting with a very select cohort who may have similar problems. That can shape the way that you view the universe. I remember years ago when I worked in Parramatta Jail, a very experienced prisoner, he's deceased now, Bernie Matthews, notorious. He was ex-Katingal. He wrote a book about his experiences and actually became a journalist. But when I was talking to him back in those days, he said, Tim, YTC is the high school of crime and prison is the university of crime. And you've got to go through high school to get to university. In other words, when you're spending all this time in an institution with nothing to counteract the information, the perceptions you're being given, inevitably it's going to shape your view of the world and set you up for future crime. So in that sense, your development is delayed because it's stunted. In some cases, it never progresses beyond that.
And can that lead to behaviours when they are finally released? Like we've seen with SLD, that he's got this obsession with losing his virginity and getting a girlfriend, and he's doing it in a way that is quite wild. When you think about it, just approaching hundreds of women. Is that a sign of delayed maturation, or is that potentially something else?
Well, I think it's both. You obviously, as I said, you don't acquire the social skills. You're in an environment that's full of males. You don't know how to approach and interact with women. It speaks of desperation. And I guess no empathy or insight in terms of the way that you're approaching these people who would generally, you would think, find it very confronting. And it really speaks to the issue of when people are ultimately released into the community, particularly after a long period of time, with delayed maturity and all the rest of it, the need for ongoing treatment in the community to help them re-assimilate, ongoing monitoring and so on. And I guess, in some ways we're putting the cart before the horse there, because people really need to start that process whilst they're in youth training centre. So if they're released into the community without those skills, anything's possible. I'm not saying that everybody that gets released is going to behave like that, but the example you give is a pretty graphic example of where it can go wrong in the absence of supervision and treatment.
If someone is institutionalized, like someone like SLD is, who's, essentially his entire life almost has been behind bars, is there any way that he can transition out into the community better? Because it seems like they go from those, is there a transition process that could be handled better? And I know that he's now been placed in a corrections halfway house whilst he's being monitored by people every day and every time he's out interacting with the community. But is there a better system you think that Australia could introduce to help people transition out of youth detention or prison back to the community?
Well, with prison, they have a classification system. And like the person I mentioned, day one at Parramatta Jail, he was classified as maximum security. And then with the passage of time, with good behaviour and so on, the classification drops. So there's less security. Eventually they might go to a prison farm with a C classification. They may then get works release. They may live in the jail and work in the community and so on. And that, in a way, facilitates what we're talking about. If people are just in jail or YTC for that period of time, particularly 20 years, you think about how the universe has changed in the last 5 years with COVID, let alone 20 years ago. It's like landing on Mars. And if you don't have that level of support and supervision, you're almost set up to fail. So my view is there should be transitional periods, give people a taste of what freedom's like, educate them about, Melbourne, the world in the 21st century and so on, and provide support for them once they are released, because really it's in everybody's interest for that to occur. We don't want them to reoffend and commit bigger and better crimes where they go to jail. If they're going to have a crack at the title, give them the support they need.
Well, the psychologists who tried to keep SLD behind bars have diagnosed him with a personality disorder, saying that he is incredibly self-centered and unable to show empathy. Is that something that with treatment he could potentially be helped to overcome, or is that part of who he is?
Personality disorders are notoriously difficult to treat, but they can be treated. I think what's more important beyond that is whether a person has empathy and remorse, and that's derived from insight to the gravity of what you've done, insight into the need to address the issues which have caused you to do what you have done. As I said earlier, he was bad, not mad. There was no mental state defence. Having a personality disorder doesn't excuse you from a serious crime like that, in fact, any crime. But in theory, people with personality disorders can be treated, but it is a long, laborious process that requires considerable commitment from the patient and from the therapist.
And do you think the current systems we have in place would be able to help him at this point with what we currently have access to?
Well, look, there are treaters out there, very good ones, who can provide this service, but there's a paucity of psychologists in the community now. It's very difficult to get an appointment with a psychologist. There's a long waiting list, and cases like this theoretically require urgent intervention. They need to be met at the gates of the institution, and then, in fact, even before, in an ideal world. You meet the person, establish some sort of clinical rapport, so that when they're released, they're straight into treatment. I think what tends to happen, sadly, is a lot of people fall through the cracks because they can't get immediate help. And that's a matter of funding and resources and so on, either through the public sector. Some individuals might be able to pay for it privately, but you get 10 sessions under a mental health care plan. It hardly touches the sides with these individuals. We're talking years of therapy, really, consistent therapy. But you can make progress if that occurs with some.
You've spent decades speaking to people who've committed terrible crimes, and you would have seen the gamut of personality types. Are there people who are truly evil? Because we have this idea that anyone who commits a crime has some level of evilness to them, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to do that. But then we factor in other things on their own personal circumstances that might have influenced them to become who they are. But are there people out there who are genuinely born? So I mean, like, if we're talking about young people who commit a crime which is just so unbelievably out of character for someone like a 13-year-old to do, are they born evil? Is that even a thing?
I think it is. I think a lot of crimes are committed by circumstances in life, drug addiction, terrible role modelling at home, exposure to violence, developing, personality disorders, sexual abuse, and so on. And I don't agree that all people who commit crimes are innately evil. They're, in many cases, just an example of their circumstances, a product of their circumstances. That said, I think there are people who are intrinsically evil. Look at the Bolger case. I mean, how do you explain that beyond saying this is evil simpliciter? And how does it occur with a 10-year-old? And then look what happened subsequently, released from jail, reoffending. Now, that may be a function of, delayed maturity, as we've described, or it may be that intrinsic evil badness was always there.
When you are speaking to people who've committed crimes, are there those who enjoy if they have a title attached to that? So SLD, for example, is known as Australia's youngest convicted murderer. And we don't know how he feels about that. You have not treated him, so we don't know whether he sees that as a badge of honour. But if the media comes in with these titles for these criminals, do some of them enjoy that?
It's a badge of honour. At some level they enjoy the notoriety. I've been involved in some very high-profile, serious criminal behaviours in Australia. And one that springs to mind was when Julian Knight was arrested, and it's freely available on the net. There's footage of him on the Monday morning, wanting to look at all the press articles surrounding what he had done. Other people keep mementos. The reason behind this, and I'm not talking about Knight, no, I'm just making that point that he was very interested in the press, it keeps the excitement alive. They're still in the public eye, and particularly if they're in prison where they're rotting, they're not interacting with anyone, but it gives them some social relevance and cachet, I think, to be described in that way. And I don't think they should be talked about at all, frankly, or named, because it just gives them oxygen. It amplifies their evil doings and feeds into their egos.
I think one of the biggest issues that we see with SLD now that he has been returned to the community, and seeing what happened when he was returned last time in 2023, is that he gets to live his life with a level of anonymity. He was 13 when he offended, automatically means he cannot be identified by anybody. And there have been many cases where, for example, with the Bolger murderers, where people have tried to identify them because they came out of prison with a new identity, have tried to identify them, and they have faced serious consequences for that, legal consequences. But then there is another part, and especially in the case of SLD, where he showed some really concerning behaviours on being released from prison, especially around women and young children. Should the community know who he is so they can potentially protect themselves and their children from him? But then you have to weigh up those who may be vigilante and might take things into their own hands. Like, where do you stand on that?
With respect, it's a great question, and it's a complex issue. On the one hand, people are entitled to a second chance. They've done their time, dependent on treatment and rehabilitation in jail. Some individuals just want to get on with their lives in an anonymous way. But that has to be balanced, I think, in terms of the gravity of the crime and the fact that somebody has committed a crime such as this. I'd certainly want to know about it if he was my next door neighbour. It's a balancing act. I would say that if they reoffend or if there are red flags, that might be the gateway then to open all of that up, because there's no rehabilitation. They've been given their second chance, and for whatever reasons, they've continued to offend, not murder, but certainly the behaviours you describe are very troubling.
Do you think someone like SLD can be monitored well enough in the community? He'll be wearing an ankle bracelet and he's living in the halfway house and he's currently got 2 staff who are looking out for him. But like, that's a lot of resourcing put into one person. And whilst it is absolutely worth it to protect the community, I'm presuming there's only so long they can maintain that for. Like, how do we weigh up the cost of having him in the community as opposed to the cost of putting him back behind bars?
Well, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? And I agree. That's a lot of resourcing over a period of time. I would hope that during that period where that level of resourcing is occurring, that there would be treatment, reframing his attitudes, a whole lot of stuff that would enhance the prospects of him not reoffending and going back to prison. But, ankle monitoring, there's been a lot of controversy around that. There were some private operators around Australia who were used by the courts, and then it was revealed that in fact they weren't monitoring anyone at all. I think it needs to be done by the state, not private enterprise. And there's always in fact it's happened where people cut away their ankle bracelet, the urges become too great, they just want a bit of freedom, and then they're not under supervision. But I don't think that's an argument in itself for people to not be given a chance. I think people deserve a chance, but the eyes of the world are on you, and if you screw it up, you're back into the institution, because as a community we can't take these sort of risks, particularly where there's been very serious crimes committed.
A crime that's been committed by a child is so shocking, and it does leave a really deep scar in the community that is affected. And the immediate community more so, obviously, but the broader Australian community was so shocked by SLD's crime. It seems so senseless. What's the long-term psychological impact on those who are immediately affected, you think, by a child committing something so heinous that it's almost just out of the realm of understanding? And I mean for both that child's family who were raising him and protecting him at the time, and the family who've lost little Courtney at the hands of a 13-year-old. How do you deal with that?
Well, I don't think you could overstate the impact. You talk about the victim survivors, the family of Courtney, but often too, the family of an accused person are dramatically affected. They didn't see it coming. They're faced with the prospect of their child spending decades potentially out of the community in YTC and or prison as they progress, and that has an impact upon them. I think too there's a multiplier effect in the community. We're all affected in a way, and we all acquire in varying degrees of intensity what I describe as symptoms of vicarious post-traumatic stress. You read about this and you think, where have we failed as a community? What's happened to us as a community? And why is it that this kid has committed this offence? Would have been my kid? Probably not. But, these sorts of things float through the ether with individuals. So I don't think you can overstate the impact of these sorts of crimes. Murders occur all the time, far too frequently these days in Australia. But when it's a juvenile offender killing a 3-year-old, that's next level.